Well, good evening, everyone. I'm Kathleen Rhine, President and CEO of Mount Whitney Health. Thanks for joining us this evening for a conversation with Dr. Faoud Ishmael, Allergy and Immunology Specialist with the Mount Whitney Physician Group. Our topic this evening is the safety and science of the COVID-19 vaccine. Since we announced our policy for complying with the vaccine requirements for our staff, students, and volunteers, Amy Trittart and I answered questions about the policy. And tonight we're going to answer questions about the science and the safety of the vaccine. And we have with us our resident expert, Dr. Ishmael. We want to shed some light on the most commonly asked questions that we've received. So let me introduce Dr. Ishmael to you. He has extensive experience in the field of allergy and immunology. He's board certified by the American Board of Allergy and Immunology. He holds his medical degree from Penn State College of Medicine, spent his residency at Hershey, and completed a fellowship at Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine. Among his many noted accomplishments, Dr. Ishmael was a tenured professor and director of severe allergy clinic at Hershey Medical Center. He's also the associate editor of the Journal of Translational Genetics and Genomics. So before we get started, let me say thanks to all of you who submitted questions before and after our last conversation. We're going to answer as many of those as we can tonight, but we have a lot of questions. So if we don't get to your question, we will update it on the Connect page and the FAQ document, and we will get back to you individually, because we want to be sure that as you think about this really important and for some of you difficult decision, that you have all the information that you need to make the decision for yourself. So without further ado, thank you for joining me today, Dr. Ishmael, and welcome.
All right, thank you, Kathleen. I'm happy to be here. I look forward to helping answer some of the questions that employees have about the COVID-19 vaccine.
Well, good. I think the most common question that we hear is the vaccine safe and is it effective?
Yes, so the vaccine is very safe and effective. In addition to really well-conducted trials, we now have data from hundreds of millions of people who have gotten this, both in the US and around the world. We've accumulated a ton of safety data in the last year. We have no surprises. And the bottom line is that at this point, we have no concerns about how well it works and really the safety aspect. We also get asked a lot about how the vaccine actually works. And, because these are somewhat new and a little bit different from what we've seen before, I have a couple slides I wanted to review to get into that. So give me a second. Let me go ahead and get my screen up here.
That'd be great. Yeah, it'd be great. Thank you.
Okay, so the first slide really gives an overview of how these vaccines work and really what's happening in our body when we get them. So whether we talk about mRNA, which is what is in the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines, or in the case of the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, that one has DNA. But both of those are basically blueprints. And those blueprints give our cells instructions to make the spike protein, which is the protein on the surface of the virus that's really important in getting into the cell. So our cells basically act as a factory to make the spike protein. And the way this actually works is these pieces of nucleic acid, whether it's mRNA or DNA, are encased in something. And in the cases of the mRNA vaccines, they're basically encased in a lipid. It's basically a ball of lipid. And so when this is injected into your arm, this ball of lipid basically enters the cells in that area. So this would be muscle cells or immune cells that live in the tissue. And the piece of RNA goes into the cytoplasm of these cells. Our machinery in cells basically make these into the spike protein. The spike protein is then released from the cells where our immune system can see it. And then we make antibodies against it, and that's how we get immunity. Now, there are a few really important considerations with this. First of all, it's important to know that RNA can't go into the nucleus. That's where DNA lives. And so we'll talk about this in a little bit, but we got a lot of questions about, could this vaccine alter our DNA? And really the bottom line is it can't. It's just in a completely different place. And RNA works very differently, where it really can't affect this in any way to alter DNA or how our genes work. Another important consideration is that these vaccines allow our body to make only the spike protein. It's not the full virus. There's no way that we can be infected with this, and we can't shed this. We can't transmit anything to someone else. Another really important point is this vaccine is gone very, very quickly. It actually has a much shorter half-life than many of the other vaccines we get. And in fact, it's gone within about 2 to 4 days. So that's important as we think about long-term side effects. And then the RNA that's actually taken up by the cells is destroyed even quicker. So within 12 hours, that's completely gone.
Well, thanks for explaining that. So one employee simply asked whether or not she should get the vaccine. How do you respond to that?
Yeah, so absolutely. So the answer would be yes. As I mentioned, we think the vaccine is extremely safe and also extremely effective. We have really very few contraindications about why someone should not get it. The most common one would be an allergic reaction to a component in the vaccine. We'll talk a little bit about that with some of the questions later on. We're also really fortunate to have two very, very different types of vaccines, the mRNA vaccines and the Johnson & Johnson one. And so when someone has a contraindication of one, they can almost always get the other type.
But that's great to know. Another question, people who have had COVID say, I've had COVID-19, so I have natural immunity. So do I still need to get the vaccine?
Yes, and the answer is yes, you still should get the vaccine. And I actually have another slide I'm going to share here that will address this and why this is important. Okay, so this is a question we get a lot. I've had COVID. Why do I really need the vaccine? Shouldn't my COVID infection give me better protection? And so let's say we have two different people. We have a person who has had a previous COVID infection, but no history of a vaccine. And then we have a person who's had 2 doses of an mRNA vaccine. Which of those two people will be more likely to get a new COVID infection? It turns out that the person who's had COVID and cleared it but not had a vaccine is over 5 times as likely of getting a new COVID infection. And the question is why? Why would a vaccine give us better protection than the actual infection? Because people can get pretty sick with the actual infection. And there are really a few reasons why. The first is these vaccines are really engineered to give us the best antibody response. When we're infected with a virus, the main goal of that is to get rid of the virus as quickly as possible. And a lot of time that might involve a different part of the immune system, and we might not actually get a robust antibody response. The other really important point is the second dose of the vaccine is really crucial. Whenever we see something a second time, we get a boosted immune response. That's why these are called vaccine boosters. So the second dose of the vaccine allows us to produce much higher levels of antibodies. And those antibodies have what we call higher affinity. They're actually much, much better at recognizing the microbe, in this case, the virus. So the bottom line is that the vaccination is actually the best way to gain immunity to the virus.
Well, thanks, Dr. Ishmael, for explaining the importance of the 2 doses. So another question that people have is this vaccine was developed so quickly, and it hasn't been around that long, like all the other vaccines that we know about. So people are reluctant to get it this soon. How would you answer that?
Yes, so that has been a common concern, right? It was amazing how quickly we were able to get these vaccines out. One of the important things to recognize is that the reason it takes years, sometimes a decade, to make a vaccine is the majority of that is actually learning about the virus. In this case, when COVID first happened, just about every lab around the world that was able to do research in this area was doing it. And so we had a ton of information, a ton of data was generated in a small period of time. Normally, it would take years and years to generate that amount of data. Another important point is that we really have much better technology when it comes to things like gene sequencing. And we actually had a complete sequence of this virus even in December when it was first starting to emerge in China. So it's a combination of a lot of research that we're able to do in a small period of time. And the other part of it is the technology, the actual mRNA vaccine technology. It turns out it's not new. This has been around for more than a decade. And it just so happened in this case that it was a perfect way that we could apply what we learned about the virus to use this and adapt this new technology to generate a vaccine.
Thanks, that is helpful. So another question is, what are the exact ingredients in these vaccines? Are any of them toxic?
Yes, so it turns out that these vaccines are extremely pure. And I'm going to share another slide here. Okay, so I actually have listed the components of these vaccines. On the left would be the mRNA vaccines, on the right is the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. So when you look at the vaccine components, there's the active part of it, that would be the mRNA and the lipid that surrounds it. And it turns out there's not a whole lot of anything else. There are buffers that help to keep it pH. There's a little bit of sugar in there that helps us stabilize everything. And in the mRNA vaccines, there's a molecule called PEG, or polyethylene glycol. That basically helps us stabilize it so that the vaccine isn't destroyed as soon as it gets into the bloodstream. And so what's important is there are no antibiotics, there are no preservatives, there are no adjuvants. Adjuvants are chemicals that basically give us a more robust immune response. And so compared to conventional vaccine, even like a flu shot, these vaccines are much more pure. The Johnson & Johnson vaccine, very similar. The only difference there, as I mentioned before, is that it's a DNA vaccine. And instead of being surrounded by a lipid, it actually has a membrane that's taken from the adenovirus, which is a common virus that we get, but all the pathogenic parts of that have been removed. And so in a similar way, that is also very safe. And that also has none of these antibiotics or preservatives or adjuvants. And an allergy, when we see reactions to vaccines, those are usually the reasons why people have problems and side effects. It's actually those additives. There are a few things that could potentially be allergenic in these vaccines. And those are things that are they're shown in blue, in bold rather. And again, what is important, as I alluded to, is that those potentially allergenic components are really different between the mRNA and Johnson & Johnson. So if someone had an issue with one of those, the other one's typically fine.
Thanks for explaining that. So another question that we get a lot is, if these vaccines are so effective, why are we seeing so many breakthrough infections?
Yes, so there are a couple really important points with this. The first is that we have to distinguish a breakthrough infection from a severe infection. Even though we see breakthrough infections, they're typically relatively mild compared to someone who's not vaccinated. The reason why we see breakthrough infections is because these vaccines are really designed to target the original strain that started last spring. It turns out that now that we have this Delta variant, it's a little different. It's a lot more pathogenic, and the antibodies from the vaccine don't recognize it as well. Despite that, though, the vaccine is effective, and as I said before, very good at preventing the more severe complications of infections.
So Dr. Ishmael, are there people who just aren't candidates for the vaccine?
So there are contraindications to either the mRNA or Johnson & Johnson. The main contraindication to the mRNA vaccines would be if someone has an allergy to a component. And in this case, it would be this PEG or polyethylene glycol. The Johnson & Johnson vaccine doesn't have this one. The main risk that would make us say that someone shouldn't get that would be if someone has a history of Guillain-Barré syndrome, which is a rare neurologic condition that we can see with certain vaccines like the flu shot. We've started to see a few cases of this with the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, even though they're still pretty rare. We're talking about maybe 6 cases per million people. There's also a rare risk of blood clots with the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. And again, that's very rare. About 3 in a million people can get that. And it's important to point out that neither of those two, the blood clots or Guillain-Barré, have been seen with the mRNA vaccines. So again, if someone has a problem with one because they have either of these issues, they can usually get the other vaccine safely.
Well, thanks for sharing that too. Another employee is asking about the research they've done about the emergency use vaccines and the FDA approved? What's the difference? And does that bear on which vaccine somebody should get?
Yes. So at this point, the Pfizer vaccine is fully approved. It has full FDA approval for ages 16 and older, and that's for 2 doses. So a dose and then a second dose about a month later. The Moderna vaccine and the Johnson & Johnson vaccine are still under the emergency use authorization. Those are being reviewed by the FDA for full approval, but it hasn't quite been granted as yet. The additional booster doses that we've heard about recently, the 3rd doses, are also under this emergency use authorization. But it's important to point out that the Pfizer is fully approved, and that's actually one that is most commonly given at this point.
All right, thanks for explaining that. People are asking for details, assurances that the vaccine has been fully, independently, and rigorously tested against control groups and subsequent outcomes of those trials and tests. So what do we know about that?
Yeah, sure. So that's been another question because, again, we were able to generate these vaccines so quickly. People have been worried about, are these studies rigorous? Have any corners been cut with developing these and getting them out? And really, these are extremely well-conducted studies. And if you go back and you look at other vaccine studies that were done in the past, the study design is actually no different. Each of the 3 major vaccines, the Pfizer, the Moderna, and the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, have had over 30,000 participants. And for 2 of those studies, they've had over 40,000 participants. We also now have a lot of long-term data. So we've had more than a year, or actually closer to a year and a half worth of longitudinal data. So we know that there are not any significant long-term side effects from this. And then finally, as I alluded to before, we've given hundreds of millions of doses now. And we do have ways of tracking those. We have the VAERS, which is our vaccine adverse event reporting system. And at this point, when you take all of those pieces of information together, we really have no concerns. The work has been done. These were really well designed. And we know an awful lot about how these vaccines work and that was associated with them.
Well, that's reassuring. Thank you. Moving on to another question. This employee is asking if hand washing, social distancing, and masks work, then why do we also need to get the vaccine?
Yeah. So first of all, it's important to point out that things have really changed from when we were under lockdown last spring. There's not as much social distancing. You got to shop, people aren't necessarily wearing masks. We have sporting events with 100,000 people. So there's lots of opportunities for the virus to spread, and that's what we've seen with this wave. Even when we had those precautions in place, none of those are 100% preventing transmission. Even more so with this Delta variant that is about 4 times as contagious as the regular, as the first strain that we saw. So really, the vaccinations are the best way to prevent severe illness and hospitalizations and transmission.
Thanks for answering that question. Another one, somebody's asking if I've had a history of reactions when I've gotten vaccine in the past, what will happen? What happens now? And should I get the vaccine?
Yes. So first of all, anyone who's had a significant allergic reaction, whether it's to medication, a vaccine, anyone with anaphylaxis, the recommendation is that that person should be monitored for 30 minutes after getting the vaccine. The risk of an allergic reaction is very, very low, but it's not 0. And all vaccine sites are equipped to deal with anaphylaxis or more severe allergic reactions. If someone has a history of an allergy to a vaccine component, we actually can perform testing in the allergy clinic. And not only can we often clear someone to receive the COVID vaccine, but we can often sort out why they reacted to whatever previous vaccine they had a problem with. And we can often find safe ways that we can manage that as well.
Well, that's terrific. We've got our final couple of questions here. These are questions that I think are of concern to parents or prospective parents. So the first one says, is it safe if I'm pregnant to get the vaccine? Is it safe for the baby? And what if I'm nursing? Is that safe for the mother and the baby?
Yes, so the vaccine is safe for pregnant women. When the initial studies were done, that group was excluded. So in December of last year, we didn't know the answer to this. In the interim, as I mentioned before, we've given so many doses that we now have very good data on this. So we know that the vaccine doesn't cross the placenta, so it doesn't get into fetal circulation, and there's no harm to the baby. It's also really important for pregnant women to get vaccinated because they're at much higher risk of bad outcomes from COVID. Regarding the question about breastfeeding and whether it's safe for the baby, the answer to that is also yes. So we know that the vaccine also does not get into breast milk. What does get into breast milk, though, are antibodies. So when mom is vaccinated, the protective antibodies that she gets actually will get into breast milk and will confer protection to the infant as well.
Well, that's good to know. I didn't realize this. And here is what I think will be our last question this evening, since our time is going quickly here. And this is, will the vaccine affect my future fertility?
Yeah, and the answer is no. It's not really clear how this myth was started, because there really is no physiologic basis for it. There's nothing with how these vaccines work that would lead one to think that it would affect fertility rates. However, there have been a number of studies that address this, and these are actually large, very well done studies, and we haven't seen any data at all that there's a problem with fertility. So the answer is there's no concern at all about this.
Well, thanks. That is good to know too. So with that, we need to wrap up today's session. And I want to thank you so much, Dr. Ishmael. I know it's been a long day of seeing patients. So thanks for taking time this evening to answer all these questions. I want to say thank you again to all of you that submitted questions. And once again, to let you know that we're here for you at Mount Whitney Health. We know, again, that this is a difficult decision for some of you and an important decision. And one that we want to be sure we support you with all the information that you need. If you have additional questions, please reach out and we will get you the answers that you need to fully comply with our policy and continue being part of our family here at Mount Whitney Health. So again, thank you, Dr. Ishmael. Thank you, everyone, and have a great evening.